Hi, everyone. My name is Carissa Little, and I am one of the account development managers here at USDTL. Thank you all for joining us today for another installment of ToxTime. And if you are new to our ToxTime, we welcome you. Today's presentation topic is about Kratom and should you be concerned. In this webinar, we'll be discussing how Kratom is used and why do people use it. Shortly, you all will be joining Dr. Joseph Jones, Chief Operating Officer here at USDTL, with a featured pre-recorded conversation with guest interviewees, Dr. Mary Ellen Wright and Dr. Kristen Smith. Since the portion of this discussion is pre-recorded, our guests will not be joining us today for a live Q&A. However, Dr. Joseph Jones will be able to answer any questions that you may have in regards to this topic. Help moderating the live Q&A today, we also have Account Development Manager Jenny Olivos, who will be joining us shortly. As a reminder, if you have any questions, please submit them in the Q&A section at any time during this webinar. And of course, at the end of the webinar, we will open up the platform to answer any questions that you may have submitted. We have a lot of valuable information that will be given out today, so we'll be sending a recording to all registrants to view for future use. All right, everyone, so let's get started with our great discussion today about Kratom. Enjoy.
Thank you, Carissa, and welcome to the next episode of ToxTime. My name is Joseph Jones, Chief Operating Officer here at United States Drug Testing Laboratories. Let's get started. So today we're going to be talking about Kratom. Should you be concerned? So before we get into it today, if you don't mind answering this poll question for us, do you perceive that Kratom is a concern in your community? Thank you. So what is Kratom? I've been in the drug testing business for over 30 years, never heard of the stuff. All of a sudden, the past few years, the alarm signals have been raised about Kratom. Well, what is it? Is it a danger? Is it in my community? Well, first things first, Kratom is a drug prepared from the leaves of a tropical tree. Specifically, it's called Mitragina speciosa. It's native to Southeast Asia. It's actually a member of the coffee family. The use of Kratom has been used for a long, long time in that part of the world. We know it's been used for a couple of centuries. It may even go back millennia. But what the local people found out over time is that if you chew the leaves, it prevents fatigue and it helps if you're having to do hard labor, toiling under the hot sun. So you get that little stimulant effect. But then what they also understand is that if you dry the leaves and smoke them or prepare a tea from it, it has a relaxing effect. And over the last couple of centuries, they understood that using these smoked or teas preparations could help people that were suffering from opium addiction. And so they understood that they could use it in that capacity as well. So the use in the Southeast Asian part of the world, Kratom has been going on for a long time. Well, all of a sudden now it's in the Western Hemisphere, and for us it's brand new. Currently, some of the more popular ways in which Kratom is consumed is you can make a powder and you can mix that with a beverage such as orange juice or a cocktail or water. You can take a pill. You can get pills or capsules. Or you could take the leaf matter, grind it up, and make a hot tea from it. So as a laboratory wanting to have a procedure that identifies individuals that have been using Kratom, there are two alkaloids that are specific to this Kratom tree that are of interest. And the first one is mitragynine, and the second one is 7-hydroxymitragynine. Turns out that mitragynine has some really interesting receptor activity, and it's a little less interactive than morphine, but the 7-hydroxymitragynine, which is a minor metabolite and it exists as a trace component in the matter itself, actually is stronger than morphine. So this makes for like a really interesting setup as a drug. So there exists a whole list of alkaloids that are unique to the Metragenine speciosa plant. And as we can see here, the vast majority of the alkaloids present is metragenine. So this is the reason that this is the target for the analysis. One of the things that is also very interesting about kratom is that it can behave like two different drugs depending on the dose. What they have found out over time is that low doses can give you a cocaine-like stimulant effect. However, at high doses, you get a morphine-like sedation effect. So this is kind of interesting. Kratom preparations may be purchased at head shops or smoke shops. You can buy it online through various vendors through the internet. You can buy it at selected chain stores around the country. Importantly, though, I can buy it at my gas station down the street. Products that we see on the market at this time is the dried leaf or powder, and those products tend to contain about 2% metragenine. However, we can also find various extracts, tinctures, and resins, like what they put in something to vapor in gummies, candy. And those preparations can have from 7 all the way up to 40% metragenine. And this is probably one of the big issues that we're having today. This is a drug that tends to be like in the general demographic. Users tend to be, and this is according to some research that was published back in 27, users tend to be male, they tend to be middle-aged, they tend to be employed, they tend to have an income greater than $35,000, they tend to have some college education. So the kratom user could be your colleague next door at work. Before we go further today, if you don't mind, I'd like to ask you another poll question. Has the need for kratom testing presented itself in your practice? Thank you. So we saw previously that the typical kratom user is basically your guy next door. But why do they use it? And so a large majority of the people use it for some sort of pain management. They also use it to control anxiety. Some people are using it for depression. But interesting for our clients that we're talking to here today is that the substitution therapy, in that people try to self-medicate when trying to treat themselves for substance use addiction. We do not have a lot of detailed information about kratom use at this time. Reports are very limited. But one estimate that was published earlier this year is in several of the large national surveys that are conducted in our country, they have a range of past year use, self-reported past year use is somewhere between 0.7% and 4.1%. One of the very interesting observations made by the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, which was also published last year, the 2019 survey. The National Survey on Drug Use and Health is a large national survey of U.S. individuals, they're adults, and what they found is that of the people that said that they had used kratom at some point in their lifetime, this survey found that 31% of those people disclosed that within the past year they had a substance use disorder. Now, this was not due to kratom, but it's kind of interesting at the 31% of the users self-reported that they had some sort of substance use disorder. And this is kind of setting up this whole concept of kratom. It has to do a lot with the co-occurring substance use that can really be dangerous and a concern with kratom use. In a recent paper published earlier this year, Grundman and his colleagues, they had a couple of items that they appear to think are public health concerns. And so kratom has been associated with addiction and withdrawal. And so that just on the cuff of it, that's a public health issue. It tends to be used especially with the younger generation, in these polysubstance concoctions. And the example of that is a concoction called 4x100. And this is a mixture that could be with diphenhydramine or tramadol along with ethanol. In these mixtures, sometimes people can get into trouble with these things. When they do overdose, that you can see the tachycardia, you can have seizures, you can have vomiting. Some of these have to visit the emergency room. They typically are co-occurring substances in overdose deaths. And there's also this potential kratom-related liver injury. There's been a report of a connection of liver injury to kratom use. And then for the purpose of the clients that are on the line here today, kratom can also be a tool to avoid or deceive substance use treatment monitoring. And so this is something that we have to be aware of, in that people may temporarily stop using their drug of choice, migrate to kratom because not many people are testing for kratom, pass the drug test, and then go back to their regular drug of choice. And this strategy is facilitated due to the legal status of kratom in at least our country. The World Health Organization has tagged it as something to continue to monitor. The US FDA has no approved uses, and they remain silent on the matter. The National Institute of Drug Abuse is funding several research initiatives on kratom, but this is just in really the beginning stages. The Drug Enforcement Agency has labeled it a drug of concern, but the federal government has not labeled this as a controlled substance. So it is basically, at the federal level, it's allowed to be sold and consumed across the country. There are some local jurisdictions that have different rules. You'll have to refer to your local jurisdictions, but by and large, it says free to come across as, say, maybe cigarettes, or even less restricted than alcohol. I attended a conference this past summer, the College on the Problems of Drug Dependency, or CPDD, and there were numerous workshops and presentations concerning kratom, more so than what we had seen in previous years. One of the workshops that I attended was facilitated by Dr. Kirsten Smith. Dr. Smith is a postdoctoral fellow with the Translational Addiction Medicine branch at the National Institute on Drug Abuse. Dr. Smith agreed to answering a few questions about kratom from her perspective, and I would like to share that with you now. So thank you for joining us today, Dr. Smith. You have spent the past few years in the field of kratom research, and one of the questions that I'd like to ask you is, what do you think are some of the potentially useful benefits of kratom?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's a question I don't get asked that often, actually. And I think, I would probably want to answer that by citing, what kratom using people would probably answer that question with, which is to say that the benefits that we've seen consistently self-reported through various sources have been used to treat pain, acute and chronic pain, fibromyalgia, fatigue, chronic fatigue syndrome, things like that, but also self-treating, and this is all non-medical, of course, self-treating anxiety symptoms, depression, and then for a subgroup of people, who have used illicit drugs, getting off of illicit drugs such as heroin, cocaine. Most people who are using illicit drugs use more than one, but even alcohol as well. We're starting to see that more. People reporting that they're using kratom to stop drinking so much. So I would say that the people using it most often in the United States, at least since 2016, or actually since before that, around 2010, have really been using for the self-treatment of some way, shape, or form. Now, I think some of the benefits people are reporting don't necessarily fall into that self-treatment bucket, but rather people who don't have health issues and who want an energy boost, or kind of like a pre-workout or a focus, something to help you focus, or to help you sleep. And I know that sounds like a completely contradictory answer, but it speaks to what we know about kratom, which is that at different doses and different product types, you can get some energizing stimulatory effects, but at other doses and other product types, you can get this analgesic or sedating effect. And of course, this all depends on the alkaloid content of the kratom and the kratom product that's being taken. So I think that for me, being at NIH and being at NIDA, I have to say that we don't endorse kratom, of course, for any beneficial thing. If you go to the NIDA Kratom Drug Facts webpage, you'll get some really good information. But I do think that for me, what I've seen to be a fairly objective benefit is if people are not using fentanyl or something with fentanyl in it, and they're using kratom instead, even though we're going to hopefully talk about some of the risks associated with kratom, I do think that that's at least some benefit that we've consistently seen. I've seen it. I have a clinical background. I worked in addiction treatment centers. And that's how I came to know about kratom, were people on heroin using it to stop using heroin. So, it's a complicated thing. And I think that really the full benefits and risks, we don't know fully yet.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Smith. And so, I know that there a lot of research is being initiated along those lines. In the early stages of this research, what, in your opinion, are some of the public health concerns that you have about people self-medicating with kratom?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few, and I think first and foremost is that unlike other commodities sold in the United States, we don't have any regulation, right? So even if a state puts in a prohibition, that's one thing. But people who buy kratom on the internet, in these local shops, you see at the gas station, all that stuff, they don't actually know what they're purchasing. And so even though most products probably are not adulterated, some might be. I think the bigger issue is that there's no standardization. There's no way of actually knowing what alkaloid content is in what product. And so there's a two-part problem here. One, not anybody really knows that. And even some of the vendors, the big scale vendors, might know what's in their products, but a lot of people selling on the internet, even if they do these analyses, the alkaloid content can change over time and by temperature and a whole lot of other factors. So by the time it gets to that person and the way they take it, it could change a little bit more. So no one really knows what they're taking. I think that's very problematic. They also don't know that some of these alkaloids act at mu-opioid receptors. I'm not calling kratom an opioid because as a plant, as a whole thing, it's more than that. It's a whole lot of things, and we don't have time to get into it. But if you isolate some of these alkaloids, we do know that they act as seemingly partial agonists at mu-opioid receptors. So the problem with that is, if you go to the gas station and buy something and you start taking it every day, well, you don't know how you're going to feel if you've been taking it every day for 3 months and then you stop taking it. So the lack of information to consumers is very troubling, especially when you start talking about polydrug use, which if you take caffeine, there's polydrug use right there, caffeine plus kratom. And we know people mix those two. And then you can add in every single pharmaceutical drug that's licit or illicit, every single, over-the-counter medication, supplements, and then you start adding those all together and you put kratom in the mix. We really don't know what's going to happen. And we do know that the case reports that have come out, there is not a lot of data indicating kratom alone would produce an adverse event by itself, an acute adverse event. Most of those and the fatalities are kratom with a lot of other substances combined. That said, we see kratom dependence and even some indicators of kratom use disorder, which is a distinct thing than dependence. And when I say dependence, I mean tolerance and withdrawal symptoms that could emerge from taking it repeatedly. And I do think that even though it's not anywhere on the level of a lot of other substances, if people don't understand that these things are potential consequence, then that's not helpful for them, and it's certainly not helpful for clinicians who really don't know how to best assess kratom or kratom use disorder or kratom dependence or withdrawal, things like that.
So, in your opinion, what do you think are some next appropriate steps for kratom research?
We were talking about it just now. Our group at NIDA is doing a national kratom study, and it's great. It's getting us beyond surveys to do ecological momentary assessment over 2 weeks, and we're going to collect Kratom product samples and analyze the alkaloid content. And then we're going to bring in some people to our lab and do some very small lab component. But that is very, very much a drop in the bucket for what needs to be done. And what needs to be done are controlled laboratory experiments with actual Kratom products that people use in the real world, and more testing of those, but then also these isolated alkaloids to see, what alkaloid is producing what effect and what behavior, and what is the actual PK or PD associated with each alkaloid, and then these alkaloids in combination. So I think two things: the people doing the preclinical work need to just keep on doing it. We need more of it, and we need to have a lot of conversations, back and forth with translational work to the clinical researchers, and that's what we're trying to do, but it takes time. People who are in the position to write clinical case reports or forensic case reports or tox reports, we really need good information out there. I and some others recently wrote a letter to the editor about the need for clarity and context and better documentation in these clinical case reports, because a lot of them have lacked information. And if you look up my name, and I can send you the paper, we kind of lay out a blueprint for what needs to be in these clinical case reports. And if doctors out there or nurses have the capacity to write up these reports, it's a huge help to have those case reports on Kratom published.
Excellent. So, Dr. Smith, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us here today. Thank you very much. One of the public health concerns that we outlined a few slides ago was the addiction and withdrawal concern. And so here's a case study that has appeared in the literature concerning prenatal Kratom exposure. So this is not just limited to adults. We have to think about the prenatal exposure as well. So here we had a full-term male newborn. Now, in this particular case, we had a maternal history of oxycodone use and abuse. It was determined that the mother had been abstinent for 2 years following treatment, and she had been hitting all of the marks for post-treatment. And at the intake at the hospital, the maternal urine was negative. Following birth, the newborn started exhibiting withdrawal symptoms at 33 hours, and mom vehemently denied use of medical or non-medical opiates or opioids while she was pregnant. It did come out later that mom was using Kratom tea throughout the pregnancy, and she was using this personally for her withdrawal symptoms from oxycodone, and she was having ongoing sleep issues. So that case report and several others were included in a systematic review that was published in the Journal of Perinatology last year. There tends to be an association with other substances in these cases. However, this review pointed out that broad-based studies are just simply lacking. There's very little literature concerning the effects of Kratom. Large gaps in knowledge include that when moms are executing their surveys or questionnaires prior to delivery, Kratom is not one of the questions that is being asked. There's very little objective laboratory testing. Metragenine testing is very new, and many subscribers are not asking for a metragenine test on the urine, the hair, or the umbilical cord. And then the biggest issue is that there is practically no information about the prenatal effects of Kratom on the unborn child. So when this review paper crossed our desk, we immediately reached out to Dr. Mary Ellen Wright, who was the corresponding author. Dr. Wright is an assistant professor in the School of Nursing at East Tennessee State University. Dr. Wright's research interests include studying the health risk of prenatal exposure to Kratom, as well as other substances. Dr. Wright agreed to share some of her thoughts with us today, and I would like to share them with you now. So thank you, Dr. Wright, for joining us today to give us your insights about the Kratom issue. And so one of my first questions is that you were the author of a review paper recently called "The Outcomes of Mothers and Newborns to prenatal exposure to kratom, a systematic review. And what I would like to know is kind of what inspired you to initiate that manuscript?
Well, thanks for that question, because I think that's a great story to tell. I had conducted a study of mothers with addiction and substance use disorder and recovery, a qualitative study over a number of years that resulted in a manuscript that's also out in maternal child nursing, but it also is a book, I Do Love My Baby. And these stories helped us understand that these mothers who are using substances in pregnancy may not know about the substances that they're using and the effects. They also are highly motivated to know the effects of the substances. And part of the stories told us that they were often not asked about legal substances that they were using. So the typical question that everyone checks off is, are you using illegal substances? Do you have a substance use problem? Are you using alcohol? And those questions don't get at the multiplicity of novel psychoactive substances and legal substances that people use, or herbal supplements that could have some effects. And the mothers wanted to know, what's the effect on me and what's the effect on the baby? And the ones that were using kratoms, in another study that we've conducted that we're still publishing from the internet blogs of mothers using kratom during pregnancy and the early postpartum period, those mothers said that they weren't asked about kratom. And even if they told the clinician, I'm using kratom, the clinician often didn't know what it was or didn't know of any effects, and it just was ignored. There was no follow-up questioning about it. So they went on thinking it was okay. And then when they started to hear about withdrawal symptoms or people that they knew that were on kratom withdrawing, or they themselves were trying to get themselves off the substance and started to experience withdrawal symptoms in pregnancy, they realized that there was such a thing as withdrawal from kratom. So they asked me, hey, could you do some more work on this? Because we don't know what the effects were, and other mothers don't know. So that inspired me, besides my own curiosity about these substances and perinatal exposure and the effects, really was the impetus to say, I'm going to really take this on. And we really need to do some more discovery.
And thank you for that work, because it was eye-opening for us. And there was a couple of major findings from my perspective, but I'd like to hear it from you in your work up to that point. What were your major findings executing the manuscript for that review paper?
I think the major finding was the signs of withdrawal that occurred from perinatal exposure. So that the moms were going through withdrawal and the babies too. Now, we do have to preface this and say the moms and babies that actually needed pharmacologic intervention for the withdrawal also had other substances on board. So, as we all know, we're recognizing the fact that polysubstance use is really the larger use category. And polysubstance includes nicotine and also prescribed SSRIs for depression and anxiety disorders. So we know when there's nicotine and SSRIs on board, we may have some increased signs of withdrawal from opiate exposure. So we also need to consider that with these other substances that use the same track as opiates, are used as substitutes for opiates, so to speak. Could those same interactions cause different severity of withdrawal? So for me, that opens another door of discovery. What are the combinations? Besides understanding kratom withdrawal, we also have to start looking at this polysubstance use in combinations. So that was one major finding. Another thing that I was curious about anecdotally was the use of gabapentin with kratom, because gabapentin is being used to suppress withdrawal symptoms and craving symptoms. So cravings, sometimes the gabapentin has been prescribed in the past by clinicians, not as much anymore, but once that happens, we all know that that substance becomes a street drug then. And so it's common for people to pick up gabapentin as they're picking up their other substances as an antidote for this cravings. And so I was curious about kratom and gabapentin. In one of the cases that had to have pharmacologic intervention, that was the combination that was being used. So again, besides kratom solely, what are these combinations that we're seeing that are going to exacerbate withdrawal symptoms, both in mom and in the baby?
What was the biggest surprise that you came across?
I think the responses of clinicians. I think, and I use the broader term clinicians or healthcare workers, about kind of ignoring this kratom use, kind of saying there's no problem with it, without the science being there, without the evidence to really say that. And so I think, to me, that is always the surprise. Like, why wouldn't we be following this up? And we need to continue to do these case reports when we have confirmed kratom use. We need to ask about these substances. And that's, to me, the first clinical step in addressing these issues. I think my frustration is that we don't have prevalence data, and it's a catch-22. When you're getting funding for research, everyone wants to see the significance of the problem. And when you don't have prevalence data to show significance, it's hard to make a case that we need to study this or get the funding or the support to study it. But if we don't ask about it and we don't test for it, we'll never know the prevalence. So as researchers, we're trying to attack that question now. What is the prevalence of use in the perinatal period? But at the same time, we need to address the fact that it is being used at increasing rates, and we may be seeing signs of withdrawal in babies and mothers now. No matter what the prevalence is, one is enough, to say this baby, this mom is going through withdrawal from kratom use, and we need to respond to that. And what is the best way to respond clinically to this exposure?
So what do you think are the major implications of your findings going forward?
I think to continue to work on our history taking, to include substances that we don't typically think about. And I have another study that I'm launching with actually honor students and graduate students on language, how to ask the questions to get these other substances and make people comfortable to report out these other substances. Because the best toxicology is what I call the oral toxicology. If someone's telling you that they're using a substance, they have no motivation to tell you they're using a substance other than the truth that they are. And so I think we have to work on that. We also have to, and I'm so glad to be working with USDTL on this, continue to develop our toxicology, understand thresholds, understand differences in populations in those thresholds and in those findings. So we still have work to do on that, but applauding the efforts for the identification and toxicology of these novel psychoactives. Begin to put them on our panels more universally, not ignore that bit, to be able to order that spectrometry to pick up these other substances is vitally important. And then to develop the evidence on response. What are the non-pharmacological and pharmacological interventions we need to do to prevent severe withdrawal, and also the non-pharm as far as encouraging recovery and recovery programs, using trauma-informed care, using motivational interviewing, using the techniques that we know are effective in our recovery systems.
when I read your review paper last year, um, my biggest surprise was just how few data points there are out there concerning prenatal kratom exposure. And we passed it around our group and we're like, okay, we need to call Dr. Wright and see if we can't collaborate on a project. And you were gracious enough to work with us, and we thank you for that. And so we recently published a paper called The Identification of Prenatal Exposure to Mitragynine Using Umbilical Cord Tissue. And so now that that process is over, we've submitted the manuscript. It's been published. So from your perspective, what are the implications going forward of having a routine test available to identify prenatal exposure to kratom?
I think it's becoming more and more important because kratom is becoming more and more available, particularly in the United States, but around the world too. It has international implications. So as any substance becomes more and more available and more popular, it's going to increase that prevalence. And we need to know, and we need to have an efficient, inexpensive way to identify this and confirm it. Again, that oral history taking is important, but we all know that work in the field, confirmatory testing is also very important, because when you're starting your intervention strategies, you want to do a safety plan for this family. You want to make sure that the mother and the baby are in a safe place, that they're getting all the services they need. And without confirmatory testing, sometimes turning on those resources can be blocked or impossible to do. So I think it's vital. I think that it gives us an opportunity to do the interventions that we should be doing with these families. And that's really how I explain it to families too about disclosure. It's not about catching you. It's about providing more resources to you. And you're struggling with this and you're using different substances. You're obviously reading, you're trying to find out information to get you through this pregnancy and a healthy baby. Let us help you. There's other resources we could put in place once we know that this is on board.
What are your major concerns about prenatal exposure to kratom?
I think my major concern is what does kratom represent? Number one, it is a substance being used for a reason. And what are the reasons? And what can we do to address those reasons? Because it could be kratom, it could be something else. Okay, and we have a long history of drugs and substances being used as a substitute too. As you and I have talked before about the origin of heroin was used as an opiate substitute. Okay, that was the origin. That's why it was created. These substances are being created as a substitute legal substance that's available in place of. And there is a community that's saying, oh, that's a good thing. Well, it can be, but when we don't know the evidence of what that substance is going to cause, then we really are putting people at risk. I have a beautiful St. John's wort plant in my yard. It's absolutely gorgeous. The bees love it. But if I made a tea of that, or if I took my foxglove flower, which is absolutely gorgeous, out of my perennial garden, and made a tea out of it, I'd be giving myself digitalis. So, you know, these substances sound natural and wonderful, but they have an effect. And we need to know what that effect is. And so, to me, that's the trajectory of this work. And it's answering the call from the mothers saying, we want to know. We want to know what the effect is on ourselves and our babies. It's not that we don't want to know. And those that say it's okay as a substitute, we don't need to know about it. No, we really do. We really need to know what to tell people. We really need to know what resources. And we need to address what are the underlying issues that's making someone use that substance, whatever it is. the Rolodex of whatever it is.
Absolutely. Well, Dr. Wright, thank you for taking time out of your busy day to give us your insight on this very important subject.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you taking the time to interview me, and I love working with you and the USDTL. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So what are we seeing here at USDTL? We have not received a sufficient number of requests to report valid statistics for urine or hair at this time, but we have had several early adopter hospitals requesting Kratom testing since we launched the test in 2020. The positivity rate for prenatal Kratom exposure is roughly 0.5%. This prevalence is in agreement with a couple of other reports concerning prenatal Kratom exposure that I saw at the CPDD conference this past summer. While 0.5% may not sound like a lot at first glance, we have to remember that it is in the same prevalence ballpark as some other very important components of a comprehensive panel, such as hydrocodone, tramadol, and meperidine. We also need to point out that with so few hospitals asking about Kratom or requesting Kratom testing, the prevalence reported here is most likely skewed due to not testing all the cases that should be tested for prenatal Kratom exposure. If we do not test for it, we will not find it. So this brings us near the end of our presentation here today. And so we want to leave you with a few thoughts before we move into question and answers. And that is, please visit our website. We have a number of infographics, posters, and news articles that you may find of interest. Please feel free to download those and pass those around to individuals in your office or community. Also, please call into client services or email the two email addresses below to see what testing options are available for you and ask them how to order the test. Also, if you're not set up to send specimens to USDTL, please reach out to, if you're a hospital, newborn@usdtl.com, or if you're not a hospital, adult and child at usdtl.com, and learn how you can set up an account to send specimens to USDTL. So thank you for your attention today, and now we will open the floor up to questions at this time.
Thank you, everyone, for that wonderful presentation. You can enter those questions in the Q&A tab that's located at the bottom of your screen. We will do our best to get to as many questions as we can. Any questions that we don't get to today will be followed up after the event. So to start off, Dr. Jones, our first question is, are there any existing neonatal studies?
There's not many. There's a couple of case studies, and this was the main takeaway that caused us to reach out to Dr. Wright to collaborate on the paper that we published earlier this year. But doing her systematic review, she only came up with a handful of case reports about this, and those case reports tended to have Kratom paired with another drug. They tended to include neonatal abstinence syndrome type withdrawal, and some of them were medically assisted for the weaning off of the drugs. But just the amount of press, if you will, that Kratom has been receiving the past few years, and the lack of literature on that area was that was like there was not much literature at all. So we felt compelled to reach out to Dr. Wright, who apparently is concerned, as she just said, about this particular topic. And we published a method on the detection of mitragynine in umbilical cord tissue, and then published our prevalence results in there, which some of that I just shared with you on that last slide. And so that's kind of the beginning of it, because you need to objectively identify what's going on with the child before you can kind of study what's going on. So next steps there will be to find some partner hospitals or researchers at NIH that are interested in this topic, and take a look at some of these children, and then of course do some long-term prospective studies on them to see if there are or are not any long-term repercussions of that. The real difficult thing in that is going to be, it tends to be polysubstance. So just studying kratom by itself, as both of the guests mentioned, it tends to be polysubstance, and then your questions kind of explode exponentially when you think about when you start taking away this drug and studying it versus another drug and putting them together, and just gets super complicated when you kind of try to work through that. But that's my answer to that for now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jones. Our second question is, how long does kratom stay in your system?
You know, I am not aware of any specific data that's highlighting that. And it could just be that I've missed it. I've just not had the opportunity to come across it. But I think that we could make some assumptions based on other drugs that are similar to it. I think we can probably figure blood is for a day or two. We can figure saliva for 1 to 3 days. We can figure on urine testing for 2 to 3 days, like most other alkaloids. And for hair, assuming there's nothing weird about the binding to the proteins or melanin in the hair, we can probably figure on about 3 months for head hair and maybe up to a year for body hair. And 6 months for fingernails, maybe up to a year for toenails. And that's just based on the anatomy and the physiology of the hair and nail growth, which it kind of averages out due to the way that the samples are processed and the cutoffs. But we could make those assumptions, and like if you're testing a toenail, and we say that the detection window may be up to a year, it's not necessarily up to a year, but because that clipping is that old, and if we find it there, we can't discount that it was laid down a year ago. Not at this time. We can't do that. Maybe down the road we'd be able to say those things, but just not now. So I think we can stick to the traditional detection windows and go from there.
Thank you. And which specimen types is kratom testing available in?
You know, it's technically available in every specimen type. Now, whether or not it's being offered commercially is another question. And so obviously there is urine and hair testing and UCOR testing going on now, and we can offer that at our laboratory. Although we do not get many requests for urine or hair, we are getting a decent number, and it's because it's related to the NAS topic with the on the newborn side. But it should be, but I'm not specifically sure if some of the other labs offer it in like blood and oral fluid. Understanding what's available commercially for the screening and the technology that's available for confirmation, there's no reason they couldn't do it for blood or for oral fluid. The question would be, is there enough demand to do it, on a commercial routine basis? But routinely, urine, hair, fingernails, umbilical cord.
Will kratom trigger immunoassay screens?
That's a good question. All right. So, to the best of my knowledge, with the immunoassay kits that I am aware of and I have experience with, kratom does not interfere or interact with those kits, and you have to get a metragenine specific kit. I know, because I've used it, there's at least one out there that's commercially available. I think I've seen a second one come out in the past year. Don't hold me to that. But the issue with that immunoassay is that there's just not a lot of demand for that. And so there's supply interruption that we order it and it's like 3 months before it comes in. That's because they're not like making it every day to ship out like they would a cocaine kit. And so that becomes, for a production lab, that becomes a problem. Postmortem lab, that's probably not that big of a deal. Turnaround time is not, does not have the same pressures that we have with the type of work that we do. But as far as the specific question, you need a metragenine specific kit in order to get a signal from metragenine.
Thank you. Lots of great questions, everyone. Thank you for submitting them through. So I have this other one. What is active of on-site kratom testing? Do various strains of kratom require different testing?
I don't know. And so I am not familiar with the on-site, and I'm assuming we're talking about a laminar flow dipstick, if you will, type test. I was not aware that there was one available, and because we tend to, in our market, we tend to not use those products. If they're FDA cleared, it should work, but you'd have to look at the cutoff and compare it with the literature cutoff that you would expect to see urine positives. As far as the different strains of kratom, I am aware, and I have to couch a lot of my answers with I'm aware, because there's just not a lot of literature and stuff is coming out every day on this. Case in point, while I was kind of trying to prepare myself for this presentation, I came across an ebook through Frontiers in Pharmacology that actually Dr. Smith, who was a guest here today, was a contributing author, and I believe she was an editor on that ebook. And a wealth of information is in there, and I've not had a chance to read through. It's like 200 something pages, right? But as far as different strains of the kratom, I think the primary issue is still metragenine across the different products. However, I do recall hearing about a year and a half ago, but I've not heard this mentioned since, about genetically engineering or synthesizing or selective extraction to make products that would emphasize the 7-hydroxymetragenine over the metragenine. It was like I heard that for a little while, and then I've not heard that in over a year. So I don't know if that went nowhere or if it was like fantasy talk or whatever. I know that in our experience, at the lab level for the newborns, and so we do a couple of thousand of these a quarter to get some decent stats. And what we're seeing is that only a fraction of the positive metragenines have an accompanying 7-hydroxymetragenine. And that average percentage is about 6% of the metragenine, and that's all of them. And we have not had, up till now, we've not had an instance of a metragenine negative with a 7-hydroxymetragenine positive. And so what that tells me is that maybe there's talk of a 7-hydroxymetragenine product, but it was talk because if that was the case, we'd see all 7-hydroxy probably, and we're just not seeing that. So maybe that was talk and it never came to fruition, or maybe it's in the pipeline and we're going to start seeing it next week for all we know. This is all brand new stuff. It's evolving pretty quickly.
So when you talk about testing kratom, do you mean the parent drug metragenine or metabolite 7-OH, or both?
So that's a good question. And so what we're looking for in the test that we're doing is that we are looking for, like in the case of the Eucord, we're looking for prenatal kratom exposure. And we're doing that by looking primarily for metragenine. And early on, because of this discussion of the 7-hydroxy being a metabolite and it being a trace component, and people looking at augmenting the products to be primarily 7-hydroxy, we included both of those compounds in our assay that we're doing. Turns out 7-hydroxy has a lot of difficult things about it. And there is another compound, speciogenine, I believe is the way you pronounce it, that is really close to one of those compounds and makes it really difficult to tell them apart. And so if you're studying which one of those compounds has a specific effect, then having a complete resolution of that is very, very important, at least at this time. But we're looking for kratom exposure. And so detection of either one of those is what we're looking for. And as you saw in the little pie chart, 66% of what's floating around in that leaf of the alkaloids in the leaf is metragenine. So that's like the obvious target that we're going after. But good question, thank you.
Yeah, so we have time for a couple more questions here before we wrap up. So the next question is, what will Kratom flag for on a drug test, or will it not show up on a normal 10-panel expanded drug test?
It's not going to be in a 10 panel, and it's going to be a much more extended panel than the 10. It's like the 17 panel in umbilical cord and like the 19 panel in hair. So all of those guys in the middle are just not going to see. I want to say guys in the middle, I mean the drug classes that you go through to get to that. It's not going to show up unless you specifically order the metragenine strain.
Thank you. So our last question for today is, can Kratom cause a false positive for opiates?
No. Just no. No long-winded answer there, Jenny. Just no.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. I want to thank again Dr. Jones for answering these questions for us. And thanks again to Dr. Mary Ellen Wright and Dr. Smith for their wonderful insight. If we did not get to your questions, please send us an email to adultandchild@usdtl.com. Or if you're a hospital, email us at newborn@usdtl.com. We will be doing a ToxTime on FASD awareness in September. So keep an eye on your inbox for more information on the event. Don't forget to follow us on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter for the most up-to-date information about USDTL. I want to thank you guys again, and I hope you guys have a great day.
Subscribe to our channel to see more videos like this.